Hello! Today we are going to continue our discussion of the Transcendentalist by looking at Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. If you remember from our video, this particular essay by Thoreau was inspiration for people like Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, the Nazi resistance movement. So it has inspired a lot of people to strive for moral reform and change in their government and in their society. So let's have a look at it. On the Duty of Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least, and I should like to see it acted upon more rapidly and systematically. So right off, Thoreau is saying a government needs to be as small as possible. It needs to do as little as possible and not insert itself into the lives of its citizens. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which also I believe, that government is best which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. So Thoreau asserts that at some point in the evolution of men that it will be possible for there to be no government at all. Government is at best but inexpedient, but most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. The objections which have been brought against a standing army, and they are many and weighty, and deserve to prevail, may also at last be brought against a standing government. The standing army is only an arm of the standing government. So with the founding of the United States and the discussion moving forward from the founding of the United States, there are a lot of objections to a standing army, like an army that always exists, which we do have a standing army in the United States now. James Madison stated, the means of defense against the foreign danger have always been instruments of tyranny at home. So the Founding Fathers believed that a standing army gave opportunity for the government to use that army against the regular citizens. And they did not approve of a standing army. The government itself, which is only the mode which the people have chosen to execute their will, is equally liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. Witness the present Mexican War, the work of comparatively a few individuals using the standing government as their tool. For in the outset, the people would not have consented to this measure. So you may have studied the Mexican-American War in history or social studies, but this is when the United States annexed Texas and then fought the war to keep Texas against Mexico, and many, many people, including Abraham Lincoln, believed that this war was immoral and should never have happened. This American government, what is it but a tradition, though a recent one, endeavoring to transmit itself unimpaired to posterity, but each instant losing some of its integrity. Now we know how the Transcendentalists felt about traditions, right? They do not like traditions. They prefer each thing be new and vital. It has not the vitality and force of a single living man, for a single man can bend it to his will. What a huge thought here, that the government, the entire government, does not have the force of a single living man. So again, the transcendental idea of elevating the individual, there is nothing more powerful than the individual in their philosophy. The government does not keep the country free. It does not settle the West. It does not educate. The character inherent in the American people has done all that has been accomplished, and it would have done somewhat more if the government had not sometimes got in its way. So he's saying here that everything good that's been done so far in the United States was done by people, by the individual. The individual are the people who settle the West and educate people and make America what it is. For government is an expedient by which men would fain succeed in letting one another alone, and, as has been said, when it is most expedient, the governed are most let alone by it. Trade and commerce, if they were not made of Indian rubber, would never manage to bounce over the obstacles which legislators are continuously putting in their way. If one were to judge these men wholly by the effects of their actions, and not partially by their intentions, let's move our page down, they would deserve to be classed and punished with those mischievous persons who put obstructions on the railroads. So Thoreau asserts here that the government interferes too much in commerce and trade, i.e. the economy, and that their interference has made it very difficult for those things to succeed, so much so that it is equal to the danger of people who put things on railroads. And if you know, like if you put an obstruction on a railroad, you could injure like everybody who's on that train, right? So he's saying the government is like that. They put these obstructions in front of commerce and the economy. But to speak practically and as a citizen, unlike those who call themselves no government men, I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government. So he is making it clear here. He's not looking for anarchy, right? A person who believes in no government is a person who believes in anarchy. He says, I'm not saying there should be no government, but I think we should have a better government. Let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step toward obtaining it. The mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. They are the standing army and the militia, jailers, constables, posse comitatus, etc. In most cases, there is no free exercise whatever of the judgment or of the moral sense, but they put themselves on level with wood and earth and stones, and wooden men can perhaps be manufactured that will serve the purpose as well. Such command no more respect than men of straw or a lump of dirt. They have the same sort of worth only as horses and dogs, yet such as those even are commonly esteemed as good citizens. Okay, so Thoreau's going to go into here the different ways that people serve the government and or society. Okay, he's the state or society. He says the first group of people serve with their bodies, and they are basically robots. Like if he had the word robot at this time, which of course they did not have that word yet, he would have said they're robots, because all they do is they give their bodies, they move things, they physically do the things necessary, but they do not engage their judgment, their mind, or their morals. They obey, basically. And he says these people are considered good citizens. The others, as most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders, serve the state chiefly with their heads. So our first group serves with their bodies, the second with their minds. And as they rarely make any moral decisions, they are as likely to serve the devil, without intending it, as God. So he has a little bit of kindness here, saying that maybe they do bad things without intending it, right? But he says these people, politicians and lawyers and legislators, they are looking at things logically. Maybe we could use the word Machiavellian, just the ends justify the means, but they are not looking with their moral senses, okay? So we have bodies, we have heads. A very few, as heroes, patriots, martyrs, reformers, in the great sense, and men, serve the state with their consciences also, and so necessarily resist it for the most part, and they are commonly treated by it as enemies. A wise man will only be useful as a man, and will not submit to be clay, and stop a hole to keep the wind away, but leave that office to his dust at least. Okay, so bodies, heads, and then some serve with their conscience, with their morals. And he's saying those are reformers, people who try to make the world better. I would argue he put Martin Luther King Jr. in this category. or other people who try to improve the world for better. Moving on to a different thought. All voting is a sort of gaming like checkers or backgammon with a slight moral tinge to it. A playing with right and wrong, with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it. The character of the voters is not at stake. I cast my vote, perchance as I think right, but I am not vitally concerned that that right should prevail. I am willing to leave it to the majority. Its obligation, therefore, never exceeds that of expediency. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it. Okay, so that's a big statement. Even when you vote for what you think is morally right, you're really not doing anything for it. It is only expressing to men feebly your desire that it should prevail. A wise man will not leave the right to the mercy of chance or wish it to prevail through the power of the majority. There is but little virtue in the action of masses of men. Okay, so here he's saying you go and vote, but really it's not a very strong action. You are doing what makes you feel good, like, oh, I voted, and then just leaving it to the majority. I did my part, and now whatever happens, happens. But he's saying if something is morally wrong or right, whichever thing you're fighting for, you have to do more than just vote. He's saying that just voting is not enough, and that normally the majority of people are not going to choose what is morally right. When the majority shall at length vote for the abolition of slavery, it will be because they are indifferent to slavery, or because there is but little slavery left to be abolished by their vote. They will then be the only slaves. Only his vote can hasten the abolition of slavery who asserts his own freedom by his vote. Okay? So he's saying that by the time a moral change is accepted by the majority, it's probably too late. Like it's already somehow been decided by the economy or something else. All right, and now we're at the top of the page here. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? So he puts forth three choices here. Obey an unjust law, try to change it but follow it while we're trying to change it, or stop following the unjust law immediately. Men generally, under such a government as this, think they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them. They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. Why is it not more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? Why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it cry and resist before it is hurt? Why does it not encourage its citizens to be on the alert, to point out its faults, and do better than it would have them? Why does it always crucify Christ, and excommunicate Copernicus and Luther, and pronounce Washington and Franklin rebels? Okay? So he's saying the government is the one who makes moral change difficult, and he's questioning why. Like, why doesn't it make a way for that reform? And that would be an interesting discussion. Like, why does the mass, the government, the society avoid moral reform and treat poorly those people who would change it? If you go back and look at nearly anybody who has sought change, they are very poorly treated. And he here lists Christ and Copernicus and Luther, Washington and Franklin, although Washington and Franklin eventually, since we won, were met with respect. And then I'm sure you can even think of more contemporary examples. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. So if the government is unjust, then a just person is going to be in prison. Okay, so I just moved that line to the top right there. The proper place today, the only place which Massachusetts has provided for her freer and less desponding spirits, is in her prisons, to be put out and locked out of the state by her own act, as they have already put themselves out by their principles. So their principles have separated them from society, and now society is separating them by putting them in jail. It is there that the fugitive slave and the Mexican prisoner on parole and the Indian come to plead the wrongs of his race should find them. And on that separate but more free and honorable ground, where the state places those who are not with her but against her, the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor. So he's saying that prison or jail is the only place a good person should be, and is actually more free and honorable than being out in the world if you are in a dishonorable society. If any think that their influence would be lost there, and their voice no longer afflict the ear of the state, that they would not be as an enemy within its walls, they do not know how much truth is stronger than error, nor how much more eloquently and effectively he can combat injustice who has experienced a little in his own person. All right, so Thoreau encourages people who want change, saying that truth is stronger than error. Eventually you will win, and that experiencing injustice yourself will help you fight more against it. Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence. A minority is powerless while it conforms to the majority. It is not even a minority then, but it is irresistible when it clogs by its whole weight. Okay, so your vote is your whole influence, right? Anything that you can do to create change. If the alternative is to keep all just men in prison or to give up war and slavery, the state will not hesitate which to choose. If 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure, as it would be to pay them and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. So he says your taxes are supporting immoral actions, and you should not pay them if they are, in his opinion. This is, in fact, the definition of a peaceable revolution, if any such is possible. If the tax gatherer or any public officer asks me, as one has done, "But what shall I do?" my answer is, if you really wish to do anything, resign your office. When the subject has refused allegiance, and the officer has resigned his office, then the revolution is accomplished. But even suppose blood should flow, is there not a sort of blood shed when the conscience is wounded? Through this wound a man's real manhood and immortality flow out, and he bleeds to an everlasting death. I see this blood flowing now. So Thoreau's saying that when you live with immorality, when you allow society to continue to make immoral choices, then your conscience is wounded and you bleed to death through your manhood, your personhood, and your morality dies. Okay, let's move up our page. All right, so at the top line, right up here. I have paid no poll tax for 6 years. I was put into a jail once on this account, for one night, and as I stood considering the walls of solid stone, 2 or 3 feet thick, the door of wood and iron a foot thick, and the iron grating which strained the light, I could not help being struck with the foolishness of that institution which treated me as if I were mere flesh and blood and bones to be locked up. So Thoreau did refuse to pay one of his taxes, his polling tax, and eventually was arrested for it. He did that. He didn't pay his tax in objection to the Mexican-American War because he felt it was immoral. So he was locked up. what ended up happening was somebody else paid the tax for him, so he was released. And he was very upset with that person for paying that tax, of course, because he was doing it as a statement against the war. But once it was paid, they couldn't keep him in jail anymore, so they let him go. But here he's arguing that he is not just flesh and bone being locked up in a prison, all right? I wondered that it should have concluded at length that this was the best use it could put me to, and had never thought to avail itself of my services in some other way. I saw that, if there was a wall of stone between me and my townsmen, there was a still more difficult one to climb or break through, before they could get to be as free as I was. So he's saying the people outside walking around were more in prison, more locked up than he is actually being in prison. I did not for a moment feel confined, and the walls seemed a great waste of stone and mortar. I felt as if I alone of all my townsmen had paid my tax. They plainly did not know how to treat me, but behaved like persons who were underbred. In every threat and in every compliment there was a blunder, for they thought that my chief desire was to stand on the other side of that stone wall. I could not but smile to see how industriously they locked the door on my meditations, which followed them out again without let or hindrance, and they were really all that was dangerous. So he says, they can't lock up my ideas. My ideas just went right on out the door with them, like it's not trapped in the prison with me, and that the ideas are what was really dangerous, not him physically, not his physical body. As they could not reach me, they had resolved to punish my body, just as boys, if they cannot come at some person against whom they will have spite, will abuse his dog. I saw that the state was half-witted, that it was timid as a lone woman with her silver spoons, and that it did not know its friend from its foes, and I lost all my remaining respect for it and pitied it. Okay, so a very strong statement here, calling the state a timid lone woman with her silver spoons. So something seen as being frail and powerless and trying to protect something that she perceives as valuable but really is not very valuable. And he's making this comparison to the state. All right, so I'm going to move this up. The authority of government, we're going to put it up at the top of the page so we can finish our last paragraph. All right. The authority of government, even such as I am willing to submit to, for I will cheerfully obey those who know and can do better than I, and in many things even those who neither know nor can do so well, is still an impure one. To be strictly just, it must have the sanction and consent of the governed. So a government, a good government, a just government, can only exist when it is approved by its citizenship. It can have no pure right over my person and property but what I concede to it. The progress from an absolute to limited monarchy, from a limited monarchy to a democracy, is a progression towards a true respect for the individual. Even the Chinese philosopher was wise enough to regard the individual as the basis of the empire. Is a democracy, such as we know it, the last improvement possible in government? Is it not possible to take a step further towards recognizing and organizing the rights of men? There will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as higher and independent power, from which all its own power and authority are derived, and treats him accordingly. I please myself with imagining a state at last which can afford to be just to all men, and to treat the individual with respect as a neighbor, which even would not think it inconsistent with its own repose, if a few were to live aloof from it, not meddling with it, nor embraced by it, who fulfilled all the duties of neighbors and fellow men. A state which bore this kind of fruit, and suffered it to drop off as fast as it ripened, would prepare the way for a still more perfect and glorious state, which also I have imagined, but not yet seen anywhere. So this article here ends with some hope of Thoreau imagining a government that treats its individual citizens as independent and having moral power. Okay? And that is on civil disobedience.